The decision that changed everything. The late afternoon sun poured through the half-drawn blinds of Ethan Carter's modest suburban home, casting long streaks of golden light across the hardwood floors. Ethan sat alone in the living room, a steaming mug of coffee resting forgotten on the table in front of him. The walls of his home were filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed, marked by framed photos of a radiant woman with chestnut curls and a laugh that seemed to brighten the entire room. Grace, his wife, his partner, gone now, leaving behind an emptiness that even time couldn't seem to fill. In Ethan's hands were two photographs. One was of Grace, her smile captured in a candid moment, her arms wrapped around Ethan's shoulders. Beside it was a grainy black and white sonogram, their unborn child frozen in time, a future they had dreamed of but never reached. Ethan's thumb traced the edge of Grace's photo, the ache in his chest, a familiar companion. A knock at the door broke the silence. He blinked, startled, and set the pictures down before making his way to the door. Standing on his porch was Mrs. Ellison, his elderly neighbor, holding a plate of cookies. Her kind eyes searched his face as she stepped inside. "I thought you might need these," she said warmly, handing him the plate. She noticed the photos on the table and softened her tone. "Ethan, I know it's been hard, but life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Ethan managed a weak smile, gesturing for her to sit. Mrs. Ellison, ever the maternal figure, launched into a story about her recent visit to the community center. "They had an adoption fair yesterday," she said, her voice light but purposeful. "There are so many children looking for homes, Ethan. Wonderful children who need love and stability." Her words lingered long after she left. Ethan found himself sitting in the quiet house, her suggestion replaying in his mind. Adoption. The word was foreign yet strangely compelling. He had never imagined himself as a father without Grace. Yet as the emptiness of the house pressed in on him, he began to wonder if perhaps Mrs. Ellison was right. Maybe life could surprise him. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself standing awkwardly in the brightly decorated hall of the community center. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. Families milled about, some already matched with eager children, others just beginning their journey. Ethan felt completely out of place, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "First time?" a gentle voice asked, pulling him from his thoughts. A woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor extended her hand. "I'm Miss Daniels, one of the social workers here." Ethan shook her hand. "Ethan Carter." "Yeah, first time." Miss Daniels nodded knowingly. "It can be overwhelming, but you're taking a wonderful first step. Would you like me to show you around?" As they walked, she explained the process of adoption and the profiles of the children waiting for homes. Then her expression turned serious. "There's a special case I think you should consider." She gestured toward a corner of the room where 5 girls played together. The oldest, tall and composed, sat with a book but kept a watchful eye on the others. A girl with glasses sketched quietly in a notebook while a toddler with curly pigtails toddled around, giggling. Slightly apart, a 10-year-old sat quietly, her body language withdrawn. The youngest, clutching a teddy bear, bounced between her sisters. "Those are the Hayes sisters," Miss Daniels said. "Ava, Melody, Olivia, Harper, and Rose. They'd been in and out of foster care for years. They've been through a lot, and keeping them together has been challenging." Ethan studied the girls. There was something about their dynamic that tugged at him. The way Ava positioned herself protectively, the quiet strength in Melody's demeanor, the unspoken bond that held them together. Miss Daniels arranged a brief meeting. The girls sat politely but cautiously, their eyes scanning Ethan as if trying to read his intentions. Ava, the oldest, was the first to speak. "Why would you want all of us?" she asked bluntly, her arms crossed. Her tone wasn't rude, just direct. Ethan took a deep breath, meeting Ava's challenging gaze. "Because you belong together," he said simply. "And I I need you as much as you might need me." Later that day, Ethan signed the initial paperwork. Miss Daniels warned him about the challenges ahead. "They've experienced multiple separations," she said. "There are trust issues, trauma responses. It won't be easy, but they're resilient. They just need someone who won't give up on them." Watching the girls walk out of the room in their tight formation, Ethan felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. It was an impulsive decision, one that would make others question his sanity. But as he drove home that night, he knew in his heart it was the right one. The next morning, chaos erupted. Harper stood in the middle of the kitchen, red-faced and stomping her feet. "I don't want these shoes," she wailed, tears streaming down her cheeks. At the table, Rose refused her cereal, pushing the bowl away with a defiant pout. Melody walked in quietly, her eyes darting to the toaster where smoke began to curl from a forgotten piece of bread. "Ava," Ethan called, desperate for backup. But the teenager stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression that said, "This is your mess now." By the time Ethan got everyone out the door, he was disheveled, exhausted, and questioning every life choice he ever made. That afternoon, Mrs. Ellison appeared at his door with another plate of cookies. "Quite the morning, from what I heard," she said with a knowing smile. Ethan sighed. "Is it always like this?" "Parenthood is messy," she said, her voice gentle. "But it's worth every second." That evening, Ethan watched the girls playing in the living room. Despite the day's chaos, they laughed as they built a fort out of pillows and blankets. Ova caught him watching and gave him a small nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he sat alone that night, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Grace. "What do you think, honey?" he whispered to the darkness. "Am I doing the right thing?" For the first time in a long while, the emptiness felt a little less heavy. The bonds began to form. Ethan woke to the sound of quiet shuffling. His eyes blinked open, adjusting to the dim morning light filtering through his bedroom window. For a moment, he couldn't place the sound until he heard a soft giggle followed by hurried whispers. Pushing himself up on his elbows, he glanced at the clock. 6:12 a.m. With a groggy sigh, he climbed out of bed and padded toward the noise. In the hallway, Harper and Rose crouched near the door to Ava's room. Rose clutched her ever-present teddy bear, while Harper held a stack of paper and crayons. "What are you two up to this early?" Ethan asked, his voice raspy but amused. Rose's eyes widened in surprise, and Harper quickly tried to hide the crayons behind her back. "Nothing," Harper said a little too quickly. "Aha," Ethan replied, kneeling to their level. "What's really going on?" Harper hesitated, then glanced at Rose, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "We wanted to make Ava a good morning card," Harper confessed. "She always looks sad when she wakes up." Ethan's heart softened at the gesture. "That's a very kind idea. Let's do it in the kitchen, though, so we don't wake anyone else up." The girls followed him downstairs, and soon the kitchen table was covered in brightly colored paper, markers, and glitter. Ethan helped Rose write "Good morning, Ava" in big, uneven letters, while Harper added an elaborate drawing of a sun with a smiling face. When Ava eventually came downstairs, her hair still messy from sleep, the girls rushed to present her with the card. Ava stared at it for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, to Ethan's surprise, her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Thanks," she said softly, tucking the card under her arm as she reached for the cereal box. For the first time since she'd arrived, Ava seemed a little less guarded, and Ethan allowed himself a small moment of victory. As the days turned into weeks, the Carter household began to settle into a routine, albeit a chaotic one. Breakfast was a noisy affair, filled with spilled milk and arguments over who got the last piece of toast. The drive to school involved more negotiating than Ethan had ever anticipated, from Harper refusing to wear her seatbelt properly to Olivia insisting on bringing 3 books for a 15-minute ride. Despite the challenges, Ethan began noticing small changes. Ava, though still cautious, started sitting closer to him during family movie nights. Melody, who had been shy and reserved, began sharing her drawings with Ethan, her sketches offering glimpses into her creative mind. Olivia, who rarely spoke at first, started asking questions during dinner, her curiosity a welcome addition to the table. Even Harper and Rose, who had been clinging to each other for security, began to branch out. Rose took to following Ethan around the house, often carrying her teddy bear like a security badge. Harper, ever energetic, began insisting on helping Ethan cook, though her help often involved sneaking bites of cookie dough when she thought he wasn't looking. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Ethan decided to tackle the garage, which had become a dumping ground for boxes and unused furniture. He enlisted the girls to help, offering the incentive of pizza and a movie night when they finished. As they sorted through the clutter, Melody found an old wooden chess set. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Do you know how to play?" Ethan asked. Melody shook her head. "No, but it looks fun." "Tell you what," Ethan said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "After we finish here, I'll teach you." True to his word, Ethan spent the evening teaching Melody the basics of chess while the others watched. Harper quickly lost interest and turned her attention to a coloring book, but Ava lingered, silently observing the game. "You're pretty good at this," Ethan remarked as Melody made a clever move to capture his knight. Melody smiled shyly, her fingers fiddling with the chess piece. "It's like drawing," she said. "You have to see the whole picture." Ava, sitting nearby, snorted softly. "She's always been good at that. She notices everything." "That's a great skill to have," Ethan said, glancing at Ava. "What about you? Want to play the winner?" Ava shook her head, her expression guarded. "I don't play games," she said simply, but her tone lacked its usual edge. Ethan didn't press her, but he noticed how she stayed until the game was over, her interest undeniable despite her refusal to participate. Bedtime remained a challenge. Rose and Harper insisted on Ethan reading them a story every night, which he gladly did, though it often stretched longer than intended as Harper added her own commentary to the tales. Olivia preferred to read on her own, but always left her door slightly ajar, as if seeking reassurance. Melody would retreat to her room with her sketchbook, often leaving her door wide open. Ava, however, was different. She closed her door tightly each night, a silent signal that she wasn't ready to let anyone in. But one night, as Ethan passed by her room on his way to bed, he noticed a soft glow under the door. He hesitated, then knocked gently. "Come in," Ava's voice called, sounding reluctant. Ethan opened the door to find her sitting cross-legged on her bed, a flashlight in one hand and a book in the other. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to actually come in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ava shrugged. "I just like reading at night." Ethan nodded, understanding her need for the quiet solitude. "What are you reading?" Ava hesitated, then held up the book. It was a battered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Good choice," Ethan said. That was one of Grace's favorites. Ava's eyes flicked to his face, curiosity replacing some of her usual wariness. "Grace was your wife, right?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice softening. "She was amazing. Smart, kind, and she loved to read. She always said books could take you anywhere." Ava studied him for a moment, then nodded. Maybe she was right. Ethan smiled, lingering in the doorway a moment longer before saying goodnight. As he closed the door, he felt a flicker of hope. Ava might not have been ready to fully open up, but she was starting to let him in, one small step at a time. The next morning, Ethan woke to find the girls in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. The scene was pure chaos. Flour covered the counter, eggshells were scattered across the floor, and Harper was wielding a whisk like a weapon. "What's going on here?" Ethan asked, struggling to keep a straight face. "We wanted to surprise you," Rose said, her face smeared with batter. Ethan chuckled. "Well, Consider me surprised. As he helped them clean up and salvage the pancake batter, Ethan realized something important. The house might be messier now, and his life more complicated, but it was also fuller, filled with laughter, challenges, and the beginnings of something beautiful. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Cracks in the foundation. The kitchen was in its usual state of chaos as the morning routine kicked into high gear. Harper, still half asleep, shuffled into the room clutching her mismatched sneakers. Rose trailed behind her, tugging on her shirt that was twisted awkwardly. Melody quietly filled her lunchbox with neatly packed items, while Olivia flipped through a book, oblivious to the commotion. Ava stood by the door, arms crossed, already dressed and ready, her eyes scanning the scene like a sentinel. "Why is everyone moving so slowly?" Ava asked, her tone sharp. "We're going to be late." "We're not going to be late," Ethan said, pouring cereal into Rose's bowl. "But we're not going to win any awards for speed, that's for sure." Ava didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders was palpable. Ethan glanced at her, realizing she seemed more agitated than usual. It wasn't just her siblings' sluggish pace. It was something deeper, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he coaxed Harper into her sneakers and wiped syrup off Rose's face, he mentally filed away the observation. Ava was a puzzle, one he was determined to solve piece by piece. The girls' school day passed uneventfully, but the evening brought its own challenges. Harper had a tantrum over a broken crayon, Rose refused to eat the green beans on her plate, and Olivia retreated to her room after a minor disagreement with Melody. Ethan moved between them like a firefighter putting out emotional blazes, his patience fraying but holding steady. Ava, as always, kept her distance, watching the chaos unfold with her usual critical eye. As Ethan tucked the younger girls into bed that night, he found himself lingering in Ava's doorway. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against the frame. Ava shrugged, her gaze fixed on the sketchbook in her lap. "Why wouldn't I be?" Ethan stepped into the room, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I don't know. You just seem tense lately." Ava snorted softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. "Tense is my default setting." "Fair enough," Ethan said, smiling gently. "But if there's ever anything you want to talk about, I'm here." For a moment, he thought she might open up. Her eyes flickered toward him, her lips parting as if to speak. But then the moment passed, and she simply nodded, closing the sketchbook and setting it aside. "Good night, Ethan," she said, her tone signaling the conversation was over. "Good night, Ava," Ethan replied, standing and heading for the door. He paused before leaving, glancing back at her. She was already reaching for her flashlight, her guard firmly back in place. The next day, Ethan decided to take the girls to the park, hoping fresh air and open space would lift their spirits. The younger ones ran off to the playground, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Melody found a bench near the edge of the park and pulled out her sketchbook, her pencil moving in deliberate strokes. Ethan stayed close to Ava, who had chosen to sit on a picnic table, her arms wrapped around her knees. She watched her sisters with an intensity that bordered on anxiety. "You don't have to keep an eye on them every second, you know," Ethan said, sitting beside her. "Someone has to," Ava replied, her tone clipped. "That's my job," Ethan reminded her gently. "Your job is to be a kid." Ava laughed bitterly. "I haven't been a kid in a long time." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, offering her his quiet presence. Eventually, Harper ran over, her cheeks flushed and her curls bouncing wildly. Ethan, look." She held up a shiny rock she had found near the swings, her face glowing with excitement. "That's awesome, Harper," Ethan said, smiling. "Maybe we can start a rock collection." Harper beamed, running off to find more treasures. Ava watched her go, her expression softening slightly. "She's lucky," she said quietly. "How so?" Ethan asked. "She gets to be carefree," Ava said, her voice tinged with longing. "She doesn't have to worry about anything." "You don't have to worry anymore either," Ethan said softly. "You're safe now, Ava." Ava didn't respond, but Ethan saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was a start, but he knew it would take time for her to truly believe it. That evening, as the girls settled in for a movie night, Ethan noticed Olivia sitting apart from the others, her book clutched tightly to her chest. He sat beside her, his tone gentle as he asked, "What's on your mind, Olivia?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the book. "Sometimes, I feel like I don't belong here." Ethan's heart clenched. "Why would you feel that way?" "Everyone else is so loud," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I like quiet. I like books. It's like I'm different." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Being different isn't a bad thing, Olivia. It's what makes you special. And this family wouldn't be the same without you." Olivia's eyes glistened with unused tears, but she gave him a small smile. "Thanks, Ethan. Anytime," he said, ruffling her hair. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Ethan sat alone in the living room, the weight of the day settling over him. The cracks in the foundation of their fragile family were becoming more apparent. Ava's guardedness, Olivia's quiet self-doubt, Melody's retreat into her art, all signs of the trauma they carried with them. But as he looked at the family photo they had taken just weeks earlier, a spontaneous snapshot of the girls laughing as they tackled him during a game of tag, he felt a surge of determination. They were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to help them heal. Ethan leaned back, the faint sound of crickets drifting through the open window. Healing would take time, patience, and love. But as he glanced down the hallway toward the rooms where his daughters slept, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going anywhere. Ghosts from the past. The autumn wind swept through the neighborhood, scattering golden leaves across the sidewalk as Ethan returned home from the grocery store. He balanced 2 bags in one hand, fumbling with his keys as Rose appeared at the door, her teddy bear tucked under one arm. "Daddy," she squealed, holding the door open for him. Ethan's heart warmed at the word. It was still new, tentative, but hearing it made every sleepless night and chaotic morning worth it. He kissed the top of her head as he stepped inside, setting the groceries on the counter. The sound of Harper's giggles echoed from the living room, where she and Melody were sprawled on the floor with colored pencils and markers. Olivia sat in the corner with a book, occasionally glancing up at her sisters. Ava, as usual, was perched by the window, her eyes scanning the street as if searching for something or someone. Ethan's stomach tightened. She'd been doing this more often lately, her vigilance growing sharper, her shoulders perpetually tense. It wasn't just her usual protectiveness. Something else was bothering her, something she hadn't shared. Ethan had tried to approach her about it, but Ava was like a fortress, her walls impenetrable unless she decided otherwise. "Anyone hungry for spaghetti tonight?" he called, trying to lighten the mood. Harper and Rose cheered, while Olivia offered a small smile. Ava simply nodded, her gaze still fixed on the street. As dinner wrapped up that evening, Ava stood abruptly, taking her plate to the sink. She muttered something about checking the locks before disappearing down the hallway. Ethan watched her go, his concern deepening. "Does she do that every night?" he asked Melody, who was gathering the plates. Melody shrugged. "She's just making sure we're safe. She always does that." Ethan's chest tightened. Safe from what? Melody didn't answer, but the flicker of worry in her eyes spoke volumes. Ethan decided it was time to dig deeper. That night, after the younger girls were in bed, Ethan found Ava sitting on the back porch, her arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't look up as he joined her, the cool night air heavy with unspoken tension. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Ethan asked gently. Ava's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the darkened backyard. "Nothing's going on." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Ava, I know you're trying to protect your sisters, and I admire that. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm here. She was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of cars on the main road. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. I don't want her to find us. Ethan's heart sank. Her. Ava's gaze flicked to him, her eyes dark with fear. Our mom. Ethan's breath caught. He'd read the sparse details in the case file, the carefully redacted reports of neglect and abuse. But hearing Ava speak the word aloud made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. She can't hurt you anymore, Ethan said firmly. The courts made sure of that. You don't know her, Ava said, her voice shaking. She always finds a way. Always. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, but she flinched, pulling away. Her walls were back up, higher than ever. Good night, Ethan, she said abruptly, standing and retreating inside. The next morning, Ethan couldn't shake Ava's words. He sat at his desk, poring over the adoption paperwork and case files again. Most of the documents were heavily redacted, the black lines obscuring key details about the Hayes sisters' past. But one name stood out, written in bold red letters on a single page. Charlotte Haynes. Beside it was a warning. Do not contact. Danger to minors. Ethan's stomach churned as he stared at the words. He typed the name into a search engine, but the results were vague. Social media profiles of unrelated individuals, outdated articles with no connection to the Hayes sisters. Frustrated, he decided to call Miss Daniels, the social worker who had facilitated the adoption. Miss Daniels, it's Ethan Carter, he said when she answered. I need more information about Charlotte Haynes. Miss Daniels hesitated. Ethan, I understand your concern, but that information is restricted for a reason. The girls are safe now. That's what matters. But Ava isn't convinced, Ethan argued. She's terrified. And I need to know why. Miss Daniels sighed. I can't share specifics, but let's just say Charlotte was a dangerous presence in their lives. The court orders in place should ensure she has no contact with the girls. If you're worried about their safety, I suggest installing additional security measures. Ethan thanked her, though her words did little to ease his unease. That afternoon, Ethan called the security company and arranged to have cameras installed around the house. He spent the evening explaining the new system to the girls, showing them how the motion sensors worked and assuring them that the cameras would keep them safe. See, he said, crouching beside Rose and Harper as he demonstrated the app on his phone. If anyone comes near the house, we'll know right away. Harper nodded, clutching Ethan's old firefighter jacket like a security blanket. Rose, however, seemed less convinced. She glanced at Ava, who stood silently in the doorway, her expression unreadable. That night, Ethan sat in the living room, the glow of the security monitors casting long shadows across the walls. He watched the feeds intently, his coffee growing cold beside him. The yard was empty, the street quiet, but the unease in his chest refused to dissipate. As he turned off the monitors and headed upstairs, he paused outside Ava's door. Through the thin wood, he could hear her voice, low but urgent. If she finds us, we run, Ava whispered. Ethan's heart sank. He knocked gently, but when Ava called out, her tone was carefully controlled. Come in. The room was dimly lit, her sisters asleep in their beds. Ava stood near the window, her posture tense. Who were you talking to? Ethan asked. No one, Ava said quickly. Just thinking out loud. Ethan stepped closer. Ava, I need you to trust me. If there's something you're afraid of, I can't help unless I know what it is. Ava's eyes darted to her sleeping sisters, then back to Ethan. For a moment, he thought she might tell him, but then her expression hardened, her walls slamming back into place. We're fine, she said firmly. Good night, Ethan. As he left the room, Ethan felt a growing sense of urgency. Ava's fear wasn't just about the past. It was about something looming in the present, something he couldn't yet see. The next morning, as Ethan checked the security feeds over breakfast, his heart stopped. In the early hours of the morning, the backyard camera had caught a flicker of movement, a shadowy figure moving along the fence line. He rewound the footage, watching the figure pause near the garden gate before disappearing into the darkness. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up his phone, dialing the non-emergency line for the local police. When the officers arrived, they conducted a cursory search of the yard, but found no signs of forced entry. Probably just a neighbor passing through, one of them said dismissively. Ethan wasn't convinced. As he locked the door behind them, he glanced at the security monitors again, his jaw tightening. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, he wouldn't let it near his daughters. He wouldn't let Charlotte Haynes, or her shadow, destroy the fragile family he was building. The shadow takes shape. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as Ethan poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, his mind still haunted by the shadowy figure captured on the security footage. The sight had etched itself into his thoughts, leaving him restless and anxious. Across the room, the girls buzzed with their usual morning energy. Rose happily eating her cereal, Harper bouncing in her seat, Melody flipping through her sketchbook, and Olivia quietly nibbling on toast while reading a novel. Ava, however, was noticeably silent. She stood by the counter, arms folded, her sharp eyes scanning the room as though expecting danger to materialize at any moment. Her hypervigilance had only grown since Ethan had told her about the new security cameras. "Hey, Ava," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Can you help me check the backyard before school? Make sure the gate's locked." Her head snapped toward him, her expression guarded. "Why? Did you see something?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to alarm her, or the others, but he also knew that hiding the truth from Ava wouldn't help. "I thought I saw someone near the fence last night. It could have been nothing, but I want to be sure." Ava's jaw tightened, and she nodded curtly. "Okay." The younger girls didn't seem to notice the exchange, too preoccupied with their breakfast. But Ethan caught Melody glancing up from her sketchbook, her brow furrowing with quiet concern. In the backyard, Ethan inspected the fence while Ava stood near the gate, her arms wrapped around herself. The morning air was cool, the grass damp beneath their feet. "Did the cameras catch their face?" Ava asked suddenly, her voice low. "No," Ethan said, "just a shadow. It was too dark to make out any details." Ava nodded, her expression grim. "It's her." Ethan stopped mid-step. "Ava, we don't know that." "Yes, we do," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "This is what she does. She waits, watches, makes you think you're safe. And then, she takes everything." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ava, listen to me. You're not alone anymore. I won't let her hurt you or your sisters." Ava looked away, her shoulders tense. "You don't know what she's capable of." Ethan wanted to argue, but the raw fear in her voice silenced him. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" She didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either, a small victory, though it felt bittersweet. That afternoon, Ethan called Miss Daniels again, pressing her for more information about Charlotte Haynes. "Miss Daniels, I need to know if she's still in the area," he said. "The girls are terrified. Ava thinks she's coming for them." Miss Daniels sighed. "Ethan, I understand your concern, but I can't disclose that information. What I can tell you is that Charlotte has a history of disregarding court orders. If she's violating the restraining order, you need to document everything and alert the authorities." "I've already called the police once," Ethan said. "They didn't take it seriously. Then escalated," Miss Daniels said firmly. "File a report, get everything on record. And if you believe there's an immediate threat, don't hesitate to call 911. Ethan hung up, feeling both frustrated and determined. He spent the rest of the afternoon compiling everything he had: the footage from the security cameras, the threatening scratches on his car, and Ava's growing anxiety. By evening, he had a thick folder of evidence ready to present to the authorities. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Ethan sat in the living room with his laptop open to the security camera feeds. His coffee sat untouched beside him, his focus entirely on the flickering screens. Every rustle of the wind outside made him tense, his eyes darting to the monitors. At 2:14 a.m., movement on the backyard camera caught his attention. His heart raced as he zoomed in on the figure, a hooded person moving slowly along the fence line. They stopped near the gate, their face obscured by shadows, before disappearing out of view. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the yard. Ethan stood on the back porch, his arms crossed tightly as he watched them work. Ava appeared beside him, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Did they find her?" she whispered. "Not yet," Ethan said, his voice tight. "But they're looking." Ava's gaze flicked to the fence, her hands clenching into fists. "She's playing with us. That's what she does." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, retreating back into the house. The officers returned moments later, their expressions apologetic. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of them said. "We'll increase patrols in the area. But without more evidence, there's not much else we can do." Ethan nodded, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you." As the police left, he locked the door behind them and double-checked the security system. When he turned around, he found Melody standing in the hallway, clutching her sketchbook. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, "can I show you something?" "Of course," Ethan said, kneeling to her level. Melody opened her sketchbook to a page near the middle. The drawing was stark and haunting. A shadowy figure standing outside their house, its face obscured. The detail was chillingly precise, down to the fence and the dim glow of the porch light. "Melody," Ethan said softly, "when did you see this?" "Last night," she whispered. "I woke up and looked out the window. She was just standing there." Ethan's stomach churned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to scare Harper and Rose," Melody said, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared, Ethan. What if she comes inside?" Ethan pulled her into a hug, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "She won't," he promised. "I'll make sure of it." The next morning, Ethan sat down with the girls at breakfast. "I need to talk to you about something important," he said, his tone serious but gentle. The younger girls looked up from their plates, curiosity and worry flickering in their eyes. Ava crossed her arms, her expression guarded, while Melody clutched her mug of hot chocolate. "I know you're all worried about your mom," Ethan began. "And I know some things have happened recently that make you feel unsafe. But I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to protect you. The cameras, the locks, the police, they're all there to keep us safe." "What if it's not enough?" Ava asked, her voice sharp. "What if she gets through anyway?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. "Then we'll face her together. You're not alone in this, Ava. None of you are." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Rose climbed into Ethan's lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "I believe you, Daddy," she said softly. Harper and Melody nodded, though their expressions remained serious. Olivia, always quiet, simply reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it gently. Ava said nothing, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease ever so slightly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood in the backyard, his eyes scanning the fence line. The shadows grew longer, merging into one another until the yard was swallowed in darkness. Somewhere out there, Charlotte Haynes was watching. Ethan could feel it. But she didn't know him. She didn't know the lengths he would go to protect his daughters. And she didn't know that the family she had tried to break was stronger than she could ever imagine. As he turned to go inside, Ethan whispered to himself, "We're ready for you." Unraveling the truth. The morning brought a deceptive calm to the Carter household. The golden sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting warm streaks across the kitchen floor as Ethan scrambled eggs on the stove. Rose and Harper giggled at the breakfast table, Harper attempting to braid Rose's hair while the younger girl protested. Olivia sat with her ever-present book, occasionally glancing up to smile at her sister's antics. Melody doodled on a napkin, her pencil moving in quick, deliberate strokes. Ava, however, lingered near the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ethan turned from the stove, catching Ava's vigilant stance. "You know, the window's not going to bite," he teased lightly. Ava's eyes didn't leave the street. "She's out there," she muttered. "I know she is." Ethan's chest tightened. He set the spatula down and crossed the room, lowering his voice. "Ava, we've talked about this. The cameras, the locks, the police. They're all there for a reason. We're safe." Ava finally looked at him, her dark eyes filled with fear and frustration. "You don't know her like I do." Ethan wanted to argue, to reassure her, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know her, but I know you, and I trust you. If there's something more I need to know, you can tell me." Ava looked away, her jaw tightening. She's not going to stop. Not until she gets what she wants. "And what's that?" Ethan asked gently. Ava didn't answer. She pulled away and disappeared down the hall, leaving Ethan with a growing sense of unease. After dropping the girls at school, Ethan made his way to the county courthouse. He carried the thick folder of evidence he'd compiled, determined to get someone to take his concerns seriously. The security footage, the scratches on his car, Melody's haunting drawing. It all painted a chilling picture. At the clerk's office, he requested public records on Charlotte Haynes, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could help him understand what he was up against. The clerk handed him a stack of papers, her expression sympathetic but guarded. "Good luck," she said softly. "Her name's been in our system more times than I can count." Ethan took the records to a nearby cafe, spreading them out on the table as he sifted through the information. Arrest records, court documents, and witness statements painted a grim portrait of Charlotte's life. She had a long history of arrests for petty theft, fraud, and drug possession, but it was the child endangerment charges that hit Ethan the hardest. One report detailed an incident where Charlotte had tried to sell her daughters to pay off a drug debt. The thought of Ava, Melody, Olivia, Harper, and Rose in that situation made Ethan's stomach churn. Another report mentioned allegations of physical abuse, though the details were heavily redacted to protect the minors involved. Ethan's hand shook as he flipped through the pages. He found an older mugshot of Charlotte, a gaunt, angry woman with hollow eyes. But the most recent photo in the file, taken during a court appearance 6 months ago, showed a different person. Her face was fuller, her hair neatly styled. There was a chilling determination in her eyes, as though she were planning her next move. That evening, Ethan called Miss Daniels again, his frustration boiling over. "You need to tell me the truth about Charlotte Haynes," he demanded. "Is she still a threat?" Miss Daniels sighed. "Ethan, I told you before, I can't share certain details, but off the record, Charlotte was recently released from a rehabilitation program. She completed her court-mandated therapy, but whether she's truly reformed is another question." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "She's been near the house. The cameras caught someone in the backyard, and the girls are terrified. I was convinced it's her." Miss Daniels hesitated. "If she's violating the restraining order, you need to file a police report immediately. Don't wait." "I've already done that," Ethan snapped. "The police don't take it seriously because there's no physical evidence tying her to the house." "Then keep documenting everything," Miss Daniels said. "And Ethan, be careful. Charlotte is unpredictable." That night, Ethan sat down with Ava in the living room after the younger girls had gone to bed. He handed her a mug of hot chocolate, its steam curling in the air between them. "I went to the courthouse today," he said quietly. "I found some records about your mom." Ava's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. I know she tried to sell you. Ethan continued, his voice heavy with emotion. And I know what she did to you and your sisters. The things you've been through. Ava's hands tightened around the mug. She said no one would believe us, she whispered. That everyone would think we were lying. Ethan leaned forward, his voice firm. I believe you, Ava, and I will never let her hurt you again. Tears welled in Ava's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She's not going to stop, Ethan. She's going to keep coming. Then we'll be ready, Ethan said. You're not alone in this anymore. For the first time, Ava's tough exterior cracked. She reached out, gripping Ethan's hand. Promise me. I promise, he said, squeezing her hand tightly. The next morning, Ethan installed additional locks on all the windows and doors, working methodically as the girls watched from the living room. Melody sketched quietly while Harper and Rose played with blocks. Olivia read a book, but occasionally glanced up at Ethan, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. When the work was done, Ethan gathered the girls in the living room. I know things have been scary lately, he said, kneeling in front of them, but I want you to know that we're safe. I've done everything I can to protect this house, and the police are keeping an eye on the neighborhood. Harper climbed into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. You won't let her take us, right? Never, Ethan said, his voice steady. You're my daughters, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Ava, sitting slightly apart from the group, watched him carefully. For the first time, her expression softened, and she gave him a small, hesitant nod. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the glow of the security monitors illuminating his face as he watched the feeds intently. Hours passed, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. At 3:12 a.m., the backyard camera picked up movement again. Ethan's heart raced as he zoomed in on the figure, a woman in a hooded jacket, standing near the gate. This time, the footage was clear enough to make out her face. It was Charlotte Haynes. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. She's here, he said, his voice low but urgent. The woman I told you about. She's in my backyard right now. As he waited for the police to arrive, Ethan stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. Charlotte stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the house, as though daring him to confront her. When the flashing red and blue lights finally illuminated the street, Charlotte disappeared into the shadows. The officers searched the yard, but found no sign of her. One of them turned to Ethan, his expression grim. We'll increase patrols, the officer said. But she's smart. If she's watching, she knows how to avoid being caught. Ethan nodded, his chest tight with frustration. As the officers left, he stood on the back porch, staring into the darkness. Not this time, he whispered. You won't win. Inside, the girls slept soundly, unaware of the battle unfolding around them. Ethan knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing for certain. He would protect his family, no matter what it took. Confrontation. Ethan barely slept after the encounter with Charlotte. The image of her standing near the gate lingered in his mind, her gaze fixed on the house as if she were daring him to stop her. The next morning, he woke early, the house still quiet except for the faint creak of the floorboards as he padded to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the backyard. The security cameras had captured her presence, but that wasn't enough for the police to take decisive action. He felt a surge of frustration, his protective instincts clashing with the reality of his limited power. He was shaken from his thoughts by the sound of tiny footsteps. Rose appeared in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear. Her curls were messy from sleep, and she rubbed her eyes as she climbed onto the stool beside him. "Why are you up so early, Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft and drowsy. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Why don't you go back to bed for a little while?" Rose shook her head stubbornly. "I'll stay with you." The simplicity of her words filled Ethan with renewed resolve. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. You're a good kid, you know that. Rose giggled, and for a moment, the weight on Ethan's shoulders lifted. Later that day, Ethan received a call from Miss Daniels. "I've been reviewing the footage you sent me," she said, her tone serious. "That's definitely Charlotte." "I figured as much," Ethan said, gripping the phone tightly. "The police aren't doing enough. She's toying with us." Miss Daniels paused, her hesitation palpable. "There's something I didn't mention before. When Charlotte lost custody of the girls, she swore she'd get them back, no matter what. She believes they're hers, that no one else has the right to raise them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're not hers anymore. They're mine, and I'll fight her with everything I have." "I don't doubt that," Miss Daniels said, "but you need to be prepared for the possibility that she won't stop until she's forced to." Ethan spent the afternoon reinforcing the house's defenses. He installed additional motion sensor lights, checked the locks on every door and window, and even bought a new security alarm system. The girls watched curiously from the living room, their play quieter than usual. "What's going on?" Ava finally asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm making sure this house is as safe as it can be." "Because of her," Ava said flatly. "It wasn't a question." Ethan nodded. "Yes, but you don't have to worry, Ava. I got this under control." Ava crossed her arms, her expression stormy. "You don't understand. You can't just fix this with cameras and lights. She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." "And she won't get it," Ethan said firmly. "I promise you that." Ava's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned away. Ethan could see the doubt in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of her fear. That evening, Ethan gathered the girls in the living room for a family meeting. He explained the new security measures and reassured them that the police were keeping an eye on the neighborhood. Harper raised her hand, her face serious. "What if she gets in anyway?" "She won't," Ethan said. "But if anything ever happens, you all stick together, okay? Stay with Ava, and I'll come find you." Ava stiffened at the mention of her role as protector, but she didn't argue. Harper nodded solemnly. While Melody and Olivia exchanged worried glances, Rose climbed into Ethan's lap, her teddy bear pressed tightly to her chest. "We trust you, Daddy," Rose said softly. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He wouldn't let them down. At 3:00 a.m., the security alarm blared. Ethan shot out of bed, his heart pounding. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bedside and raced down the stairs. The girls appeared in the hallway, their faces pale with fear. "Stay here," Ethan said firmly. "Lock the door behind me." Ava stepped forward, her jaw set. "No, I'm coming with you." Ethan shook his head. "Ava, stay with your sisters." For once, Ava obeyed, though her expression was tense. She ushered the others back into the bedroom and closed the door, locking it as Ethan had instructed. Ethan moved through the house with the bat gripped tightly in his hands, his breath coming in short bursts. The alarm had been triggered by one of the motion sensors near the backyard. He peeked through the curtains and saw nothing but darkness. "Show yourself," he muttered under his breath. He opened the back door cautiously, the bat raised. The cool night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside. The yard was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Then he saw her. Charlotte stood near the fence, her hood pulled back, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. She looked different from the mugshot Ethan had seen, older, more worn, but no less dangerous. "This isn't your home," Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You have no right to be here." Charlotte's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Those girls are mine. They're not yours anymore," Ethan said firmly. "You lost that right when you hurt them." "I didn't hurt them," Charlotte snapped. "I protected them. I gave them everything I had." "You gave them fear," Ethan shot back. "You gave them scars they'll carry for the rest of their lives." Charlotte's face twisted with rage. "You don't understand. You're just some outsider playing house. They belong with me. They belong with a family that loves them, Ethan said. A family that keeps them safe. Charlotte took a step forward, but Ethan held his ground. The police are on their way, he warned. If you don't leave now, you'll be arrested. Charlotte hesitated, her expression flickering between anger and desperation. For a moment, Ethan thought she might lunge at him. But then she turned and disappeared into the shadows. When the police arrived, Ethan showed them the footage from the security cameras and filed another report. The officers promised to increase patrols, but Ethan knew it wasn't enough. As he sat in the living room, staring at the empty backyard, Ava appeared beside him. You stood up to her, she said softly. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the admiration in her voice. Of course I did. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. Ava hesitated, then sat beside him. I believe you, she said quietly. It was the first time she'd said those words, and they filled Ethan with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. He wrapped an arm around her, and for the first time, Ava didn't pull away. The shadow of Charlotte Haynes still loomed over their lives, but in that moment, Ethan knew they would face it together, and they would win. The final stand. The house felt different the morning after Ethan's confrontation with Charlotte. The air was charged with a sense of unease, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside pulling his attention. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his cold cup of coffee, his mind racing. The girls were unusually quiet. Even Harper, who was typically a bundle of energy, clung to Ava's side as they ate breakfast. Melody sketched quietly, her pencil moving in deliberate, forceful strokes. Olivia sat with her book, though her eyes rarely moved across the pages. Rose, ever intuitive, climbed into Ethan's lap mid-meal, resting her head against his chest. Daddy, is she going to come back? Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan kissed the top of her head, tightening his arms around her. Not if I can help it, sweetheart. That afternoon, Ethan met with a lawyer to discuss filing a more aggressive restraining order against Charlotte. He brought the evidence, the security footage, the police reports, and his notes from Ava and the other girls' descriptions of her past behavior. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, flipped through the documents with precision. You have a strong case, she said, but restraining orders are only as effective as the person they're issued against. If Charlotte is determined enough to violate the existing one, a new order might not stop her. Ethan clenched his fists. Then what will? The lawyer's eyes softened slightly. You're doing everything right, Mr. Carter. Keep documenting, keep involving the police, and most importantly, keep your daughter safe. As Ethan left the office, he felt both reassured and frustrated. The system seemed designed to react to danger rather than prevent it. That night, Ethan gathered the girls in the living room for another family meeting. He sat on the floor with them, letting them see the resolve in his eyes. We're going to be okay, he said firmly. I've talked to the lawyer and the police, and we're putting more protections in place. But I need you all to promise me something. If anything happens, if you hear or see anything suspicious, you tell me immediately, no matter how small it seems. The girls nodded solemnly, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. Ava, as always, sat apart from the group, her arms crossed, but her sharp eyes never left Ethan's face. We're stronger together, Ethan continued, looking at each of them. No one is going to break this family. Not now, not ever. Harper leaned against Melody, who was clutching her sketchbook tightly. Olivia whispered, "We trust you," while Rose buried her face in Ethan's chest. Ava remained silent, but for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope. The next day, Ethan decided to take the girls out to the park, hoping a change of scenery would lift their spirits. The crisp autumn air was filled with the sound of rustling leaves and children's laughter. Rose and Harper raced toward the swings, their giggles breaking the tension that had hung over the family for days. Melody found a quiet spot near the edge of the park and began sketching. Olivia wandered toward the playground, her book in hand, while Ava stayed close to Ethan, her eyes scanning the surroundings like a hawk. "She's not here," Ethan said gently. "You can relax." Ava didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the tree line. Ethan sighed but didn't press her. He knew that Ava's hypervigilance wasn't something he could simply talk her out of. It was a survival instinct, honed over years of living in fear. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Ethan called the girls back. They piled into the car, their energy lighter than it had been in days. Even Ava seemed less tense as they drove home, the sound of Rose and Harper's chatter filling the car. That evening, the girls settled in for a movie night while Ethan kept an eye on the security monitors. The yard was quiet, the motion sensors inactive. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a sliver of peace. But the moment was short-lived. At 10:47 p.m., the motion sensors on the front porch triggered an alert. Ethan's phone buzzed, and he quickly pulled up the live feed. His stomach dropped. Charlotte was there. She stood at the edge of the porch, her hood pulled low, one hand resting on the railing. She looked directly into the camera, her expression eerily calm. Ethan's hand shook as he dialed 911. "She's here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Charlotte Haynes is on my property." As he waited for the police, Ethan grabbed the baseball bat and locked the door to the living room, where the girls were engrossed in the movie. Ava immediately noticed his tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Stay here," Ethan said. "Lock the door behind me." He stepped onto the porch, the bat gripped tightly in his hands. Charlotte didn't move, her gaze steady and unnerving. "You're trespassing," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. "The police are on their way." Charlotte smiled, a cold, empty expression. "You think they can keep me away? You think you can?" Ethan tightened his grip on the bat. "This isn't a game. You lost your chance with them, and they're better off without you." "They're mine," Charlotte hissed, her voice rising. "You think you can replace me? You're nothing. Just a lonely man trying to play hero." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm their father now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." The sound of sirens in the distance made Charlotte's smile falter. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," she said before disappearing into the night. The police arrived minutes later, their flashlights sweeping the yard. Ethan showed them the footage and filed another report, but as they left, he knew Charlotte wasn't finished. She was testing him, pushing boundaries, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside, the girls huddled together on the couch, their faces pale with fear. Ava stood protectively in front of them, her hands clenched into fists. "She's not going to stop," Ava said, her voice trembling with anger. "She's going to keep coming." Ethan knelt in front of her, his hand steady on her shoulders. "Then we'll be ready. We're stronger than she is, Ava. All of us." For the first time, Ava didn't argue. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Ethan contacted a private security company to install additional cameras and a panic alarm system. He spoke with the school to ensure the girls were safe during the day and updated his lawyer with the latest incident. Through it all, the girls began to draw closer, their bond strengthening in the face of the looming threat. Melody began drawing pictures of the family together, her lines filled with hope instead of fear. Harper and Rose insisted on sleeping in Ava's room, their presence a source of comfort for everyone. Ava, despite her lingering fear, began to let down her walls. She stayed closer to Ethan, her trust in him growing with each passing day. 1 week later, the police arrested Charlotte. She had been caught trespassing on another property in the neighborhood, carrying a knife and a note with the girls' names. When Ethan received the call, relief and anger warred within him. "She's in custody," the officer said. "She won't be bothering you again." Ethan hung up, his hands shaking. He walked into the living room. where the girls were playing a board game, their laughter filling the space. "It's over," he said, his voice breaking. "She's gone." The girls stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Rose was the first to react, running to Ethan and throwing her arms around his neck. Harper and Melody followed, and even Olivia set her book aside to join the group hug. Ava stood back, her arms crossed, but her expression softened. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes filled with tears. "Always." As the girls clung to him, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. They had weathered the storm together, and though the scars would remain, they were stronger for it. This was their family, imperfect, messy, but unbreakable, and no one would take that from them again.